Today's story is another classic tale about a fox, known in Japan as a kitsune. But while the previous stories have all been about how foxes cause problems for people, this story explains that someone who can match their cunning can actually turn them into some very beneficial allies. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to another classical Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history and culture, or you just like storytelling in general, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because, again, there are plenty more stories where this one came from. And I know that there's a lot going on in the world right now, so for the next few minutes, just put all of your troubles aside for a bit and let's enjoy an old Japanese folktale. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. There was a house. Where this house was, who owned it, and who all was living there are details that are very deliberately never explained. We can only assume that whoever was in charge of this house was both very powerful and didn't want his or her name to be attached to the story. Why? I'll leave the speculation to smarter minds than me. Maybe once you hear the story, you will be able to piece together the answer, but I certainly can't, and I'm not even going to try. At any rate, the one thing we do know about this house is that someone within its bounds was sick. Sick enough that the other members of the house grew very concerned for his or her well-being and felt the need to investigate. After checking on the sick person and asking some professionals, they came to a realization that this wasn't a normal sickness. Oh no. This was a case of mononoke yami, or ghost sickness, you can call it. You see, the ancient Japanese believed that some illnesses, at least some of them, maybe possibly all of them, were caused by malignant spirits possessing or otherwise influencing living humans. Sometimes, even being in the vicinity of a spirit could cause some very unpleasant side effects. Check out the story about a man encountering a woman on the streets at night for another example of that. Now, the typical way that people dealt with mononoke yami, and the one that the members of the household here chose, was a method called monotsuki, or medium possession. Essentially, they would get a young woman who was either trained in spiritual arts or just generally sensitive to spiritual things, or both, and have whatever was possessing the sick person move into this young woman who would allow the spirit to possess her, and then that would grant the spirit the ability to speak. There would also be some others trained in spiritual matters there who would then question this spirit through the medium, get some answers as to who or what it was and why it was doing what it was doing, and then use that information to cast the spirit out, although sometimes the spirits were strong or angry enough that getting them to say anything took hours, if they spoke at all. Luckily, for the people of the house, this particular spirit didn't actually need much coaxing, and when they brought the girl before the sick person, the spirit immediately jumped into her, almost like it too was very eager to get this thing over with. And when they began the questioning, the spirit wasted no time in getting right down to business. "I am a fox," it declared, "and it was never my intention to bring misfortune to this place. No, I merely thought that this would be a good place to scrounge for some food, but after some unforeseen events I wound up being trapped here." Well, that certainly wasn't the worst situation to be in. It shouldn't honestly be too difficult to get rid of a fox spirit that apparently didn't want to be stuck there to begin with. Now, I can't be sure, but judging by what happens later in the story, I believe that the fox had wandered into this place and then was seized upon by some unseen, much stronger protectorate deity that was also keeping it bound to the property. Reading the original text, it seems like there's some sort of very important cultural context that we're missing about the nature of spirits and gods that the writer didn't feel necessary to explain. So, unfortunately, the mystery of what was keeping the fox spirit from simply leaving of its own accord will have to be left for those more educated or better at speculation. But for now, just know that there was something keeping the fox bound to this place that it didn't seem to want to talk about. Now, after the fox spirit explained itself, but before anyone could form a reply, the medium, or I guess the fox through the medium, reached into the fold of her robe and pulled out a glittering, absolutely massive pearl, around the size of a small kamuji, known in modern Japanese as a mikan and in English as a mandarin orange. The second she, or I guess it, pulled out this gem, the whole room went silent, and everyone stared at this dazzling jewel, their sheer surprise slowly shifting into an extremely hungry-looking expression. The fox girl smirked and began tossing this resplendent stone up into the air and catching it over and over, almost like it was teasing the onlookers. This continued for a few moments, the regular humans just sitting there, not moving a muscle, avarice glinting in their eyes, while this fox continued tossing the pearl up and catching it on the way down like it was some kind of a frivolous toy, all the while grinning with a sly glint in her eye. Now some of the people began whispering to each other, asking each other if they thought that the medium had been keeping this on her person the whole time, or if the fox had somehow brought it along when it possessed the girl. Either way, everyone was so shocked and possibly too busy trying to connive a way to get the gem themselves that they weren't quite sure what to do next. The tension continued building, with some of the house members beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats but still hesitating to actually do anything. That is until one among the house crew, a young samurai, decided that he had enough of this nonsense. By the way, samurai didn't mean warrior at this time, but rather just servant, so just keep that in mind. But unlike his peers, this samurai was indeed a very brave and action-oriented young man, and he hit upon an idea. It was a simple idea, perhaps a little too simple. But so often fate favors those who act on simple plans over those who constantly scheme and never actually do anything. It just so happened that this young samurai was sitting off to the side of this medium, closer than pretty much anyone else, and just out of the line of sight of the medium. And he was watching this rhythmic rising and falling of this pearl very intensely. His eyes were fixed on it, watching, waiting, like he was a tiger ready to pounce on the most nervous deer alive. Wait. Now. In the next instant, as the gem hit the height of its trajectory, this young samurai sprang forward, reached out, snatched the gem out of the air, sat back down, and placed it in the fold of his own robes. Everyone, fox spirit and onlookers, froze. The possessed medium's eyes went wide as she looked at her empty hand as if her mind couldn't make sense of the fact that there wasn't a big shiny pearl there anymore. When she came to, she spun to the samurai and snapped, "What a terrible thing to do! Give me back that gem!" The samurai, however, simply looked away and very deliberately pretended not to hear. The fox repeated its demands, but louder. The man stayed silent. Everyone could see the fox's exasperation and panic rising as it continued to both rail and plead. As its desperation grew, hot tears began streaming down the girl's face as it spewed any and all thoughts that entered its head. "Give it back," it pleaded. "You think that just because you took it from me, you know what to do with it. You're human and couldn't possibly know how to make use of that or what value there is in it. It's useless to you. But if I don't have it, something horrible will happen to me. Please, just give it back. If you don't, I swear I'll haunt you to your dying day. But if you do give it back, I promise to be like a personal god for you and protect you from other evil things. Just please give it back." Those were some interesting claims. But the samurai was not a fool. Clearly, this fox was desperate to get this thing back, and who would trust the word of a desperate creature that is known to trick people and would say whatever it needed to get what it wanted? But then again, there's nothing like desperation to make some creatures honest. Plus, the fox had a point. Yes, this thing looked like a very fancy pearl, but it no doubt had some kind of weird magical mojo that, at best, could very well invite misfortune in the future if not handled properly. The samurai wasn't trained in arcane arts, and he was wise enough to know that blithely messing with magical things tended to be more trouble than it was worth. Which is saying something, because this gem was probably worth a lot. But while it might indeed be useless to him, it was very clearly valuable to the fox. That was something he could make use of. The man then turned to the fox and said, "So, if I give this back, you swear you'll protect me from danger?" The fox, or the possessed girl, I guess, nodded vigorously and answered, Yes, we foxes might enjoy pranking you humans, but we never go back on our word, nor do we ever forget a debt. The man continued to eye the fox with skepticism. He wasn't completely convinced. Will you swear to whatever god is above you that you will actually protect me? The fox replied with no hesitation, Of course, and then turned away and looked off to something invisible. O guardian deity, hear me. If this man returns the gem to me, I promise to protect him from danger. Having made this solemn vow, the fox once more turned toward the samurai with an eager and expectant expression. Now, the man was satisfied. He reached into his breast pocket, took out the gem, and placed it squarely in the medium's outstretched hand. The fox was elated and almost looked like it had to keep from leaping out of its seat with excitement. But after a mere second or two of celebration, it quickly put the gem back into its own pocket on the inside of the medium's robes, and a few moments later, several kenja, men skilled in various supernatural crafts, came forward and managed to dispel the fox spirit out of the medium and back out into the wider world. Mission accomplished. Or was it? Once it was clear that the spirit was gone, the people of the house then turned their attention toward the medium. She had something very shiny, stashed away in her inner pocket. They had all seen her put it in there, or rather they had seen the fox use her to put it in there. Before she had time to even get her bearings, several of the people of the house grabbed her and held her down. She hadn't even had a chance to struggle when one of the people in the house promptly reached inside of her robes and started searching. But he knew instantly that it was useless. There was nothing. They searched the rest of her clothes, but also nothing. Not even a trace of that huge, brilliant gem that they had all seen the medium tossing in the air and catching. It was completely gone. Of course, the only conclusion was that the fox had somehow both brought it along after possessing the girl and then taken it with it when it was exorcised. Apparently, ancient Japanese spirits can do that. But this is not where the story ends. Because a few days later, the man who had snatched this gem from the fox, aka the samurai, went out to visit a temple called Koryuji, located in the western part of the city in an area called Uzumasa. Now, the story doesn't mention why exactly he was at this temple. It could have been a whole bunch of different things. But whatever it was, his business kept him late. And by the time he left for home, it was dark. This was a problem. The streets of the capital at this time could be very dangerous. Bandits and thugs often roamed the streets after dark, shaking down passersby for their valuables. The samurai didn't want to lose his valuables. He didn't have a lot of them. Unfortunately for him, for some undisclosed reason, he couldn't stay at the temple, and so, despite the danger, he nervously began making his way through the dark streets of the city, hoping that he didn't end up running into ruffians. His path was long, and as the night grew darker, he found himself passing by a field near the Old Tenmon Gate, having chosen to cut through the greater palace complex, probably hoping to minimize his chances of running into thugs. Perhaps he had heard the story about another man who had seen a glow near the same gate, or perhaps that area was just known for being sketchy, or perhaps he just felt anxious passing by a spot where there weren't any houses in the immediate vicinity. But this place gave him the creeps. Something in his gut told him that this night was particularly dangerous. He really didn't want to continue on his way alone. But what was he going to do? If only he had someone else there to watch his back, this whole thing would be much less nerve-wracking. And just then he remembered. He had strong-armed a fox into vowing to protect him only a few days ago. He remembered how it had insisted on its sincerity and that it would help him if he was ever in need. And he was most certainly in need now. But the fox hadn't shown up at all that night. Maybe he needed to summon it? But how exactly does one summon a fox? Again, he was no onmyoji, or a Japanese wizard, and he hadn't been trained in any kind of spiritual techniques. He was just a young guy with some moderately fast reflexes and a wit to match, and had basically bullied a spirit into a pact. Maybe he just needed to call it. Well, I mean, it was worth a try at least. Having no other ideas, and feeling a little silly and embarrassed, he shouted into the dark, "Fox! Fox!" Not even a second passed before he heard something cry out with a "Kong! Kong!" behind him. He whipped around to see a fox running in his direction, seemingly from out of nowhere. It stopped just a few paces before him and stared directly at his face, and even though foxes don't really have facial expressions, he could have sworn its eyes looked expectant, like it was waiting to be told what he wanted. The man was stunned. I mean, he had been hoping for this very thing, sure, but to actually have it happen, that was kind of crazy. After a brief moment to process the incredulity of the whole thing, the man faced this fox directly and said, with genuine respect, "Well, Sir Fox, it seems you really weren't lying. I am very grateful. I'm actually trying to get home, and for some reason this night has me on edge. Please, see me home without any problems." Now, he couldn't explain why, but something about the shift in the fox's face seemed to say that it understood. It then trotted past him, stopped a little ways, and then looked back at him. It then went a few more paces, stopped, and looked again. It was beckoning him. Had it not actually been happening to him at that very moment, he wouldn't have believed it. This fox was indeed going to lead him back home. The samurai then caught up with it and followed its lead, extremely grateful and touched, actually, that this little creature was keeping its word and helping him out. They left the field and the vicinity of the Otemon Gate and entered the main part of the city. The wider open spaces of the greater palace complex shifted into the more tightly packed buildings of the regular neighborhoods, and the fox very confidently leading the man down the regular path that he usually took home. This fox knew the way. Feeling a renewed sense of confidence, the samurai continued following this fox through the city. However, that confidence was suddenly shaken when, after they had only gone a short distance, the fox suddenly turned down a dark, narrow alley, made by a very long fence on one side and houses on the other. Okay. This was very definitely not the usual path home. Now, the man hesitated for a moment, but quickly followed, though he wasn't entirely sure this was a good idea. As they passed through the cramped shadows of the houses and the fence, doubts began forming in his mind. Again, foxes were tricksters, and just because this fox had kept its word to show up, that didn't mean that this wasn't part of some elaborate prank. Maybe it had taken the theft and the subsequent return of its jewel very badly and was looking to get revenge. Maybe this was a ploy to get him to lower his guard, and then the fox would lead him into some kind of danger that would serve as payback. Maybe. But in this situation, what choice did he really have? It was either follow the fox or brave the streets of the capital at night completely alone. And again, his gut told him that he really didn't want to be alone this night. And so the samurai swallowed the doubts past the knot of concern in his throat and committed to putting his trust in his little furry friend. They continued down this alley for a few minutes in complete silence. Suddenly, the fox stopped, dead in its tracks, its body stiff and its ears perked up in attention. It listened briefly and then snapped its head in a direction off to the side of their path. It then dropped to a crouch and began walking forward with very deliberate and quiet footfalls. Something was nearby. Now the man followed suit and crouched down in the shadow of the nearby fence and took extra care to make as little sound as possible. When he and the fox had moved forward a little further, he suddenly heard voices. There were people on the other side of this fence, their gruff, rough-sounding words intermittently clearing the top of it, just enough for the man to know what he was hearing, but not clear enough to know what they were saying. A short distance later, they came across a gap in the fence that separated them from the voices. Now, this was a bad idea, but the samurai's curiosity got the better of him, and before he moved past this gap in the fence, he looked in. He saw in the gloom a group of men huddled together and speaking in low voices as if they were discussing something very important. At first, it didn't seem too suspicious, until he noted that every single one of them was armed to the teeth with bows, arrows, and swords. It was hard to make out for sure, but he caught snippets of whatever they were discussing, and it unsettled him. Words like, "this one," "no," "too many guards," "easier target," "how will we," and "break in," "what if we have weapons." These were bandits, and they were planning to break in and attack some unfortunate household. Now this startled the young samurai, to be sure, but he was safe on the other side of this fence. They hadn't noticed him and probably wouldn't under the shadow of the fence. But in the next moment, he realized something that made his blood run cold. These bandits were gathered just off to the side of one of the main roads. The road that he would have been walking down had not the fox led him into this alley. He had no doubt that had he simply walked home the way he always did, he would, at best, have been beaten and stripped of all of his valuables, and at worst, he would have lost the most valuable thing of all, his life. After recovering from the shock of realizing how narrowly he had avoided a terrible fate, he felt an incredibly deep sense of gratitude for his new foxy friend, and vowed from that day forth to never doubt the little guy again. The man then stealthily stole past the gap in the fence, grateful for the shadows, and resumed tailing his vulpine protector. A few moments of stepping very lightly through the shadows of this alley, and the pair safely emerged onto one of the other main streets, one that happened to be very close to this samurai's home. Here the man then looked behind him, thinking now that the alleyway looked far less foreboding than before, and thinking how close he had come to running into some major trouble. But when he then turned around once again to look for the fox, it was gone. It seemed like the little guy knew that the worst was behind them, and disappeared to pursue its own interests. The young samurai then arrived home, safe and sound, a few moments later. And that's the end of the main story. But apparently, the fox's help didn't end there. Word on the street was that this man was helped by this fox many times over the years, and every time the man needed some extra guidance and called for it, the fox kept its word and came to his aid. And each time this happened, the man's fondness and gratitude for his furry friend deepened. Sometimes he thought back to that moment when he snatched the pearl from the medium and imagined what would have happened to him had he not returned it. More than once he thanked heaven that he had been wise enough to not try to use it as a get-rich-quick scheme. A guardian fox spirit was far more valuable than some old pearl, not to mention that if he had kept it, he probably would have fallen prey to some kind of magical misfortune, and instead of having a fox for a friend, he would have had a fox for an enemy, neither of which sounded worth even a large fortune. And that is where the story itself actually ends, but the writer does include a little final moral. While foxes can be troublemakers, just as the fox in this story said, they are true to their word and never forget a debt. As such, if you ever find yourself in a pinch and have such a creature indebted to you, you can always count on them to come to your aid when called. And thus is it said that while humans are indeed smarter than animals and can learn a little bit about karma and destiny and the like, they are neither as honest as the beasts of the field, nor as eager to repay good deeds done to them. And that is the end of the story. So, if you enjoyed that story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because, again, there are still plenty more stories to get through. And please feel free to share with anybody who you think might be interested in this, people who like Japanese culture, people who like Japanese history, people who just like storytelling, or, people who just need something to put on in the background while they're driving or they're trying to fall asleep, because apparently you guys really like to put this on when you're trying to go to sleep, or what have you. Just get the word out there. The channel has been growing very well, especially over the past month and a half or so. If we can keep this up, I never thought it would get as big as it is, but it's not even that big yet even, so perhaps we can still keep going. Let's see how far we can get it. Anyway, if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshu koso haberikere, and hopefully we will see you next week for the next story where we go back to a fox causing problems for people, but unlike the others, this one gets caught, and we get to see what happens to foxes who don't get away with their shenanigans. Okay, but that is where I'm going to end it. Thank you so much, guys, once again. We'll see you later. Goodbye.